Well, I'm really excited to interview you, although, as I said, I'm a little bit nervous about this because it's one thing to conduct an interview, it's another thing to interview your mentor. So I'll do the best I can. We're thinking about this as a resource for faculty and grad students. So I'm hoping that you might just start by telling us a little something about your journey as a qualitative researcher. What got you started?
Okay, well, what got me started was that when I went off to school at Northwestern in the Chicago area, I was a music major. I was a music history and composition major. And during my undergraduate years, I got more and more interested in ethnomusicology, the study of world musics, and particularly musics where there wasn't a written notation for the music. And so what ethnomusicologists routinely did was to, in those days, audio record and then transcribe into Western notation, try to make Western notation sort of represent what the music was. So this idea of recording real-time performance was something that, you know, sort of came very, seemed very natural to me. And later in my undergraduate time, I started doing volunteer work in a West Side Chicago neighborhood. My fellow students and I gave free music lessons on Saturday at a YMCA, and I got really interested in what was going on in that neighborhood and in the city, and this was the early 1960s. And I ended up, after getting a master's degree in music history, thinking I might go on and get a PhD in ethnomusicology. I took a couple of years and worked in this neighborhood at the YMCA, and I had a grant to do some after-school informal education work with kids. And very early on, as I was doing all that, I realized that I didn't know how to understand what the kids were saying. And by then I'd had enough anthropology courses and the ethnomusicology to realize that that was my problem, not their problem. They had ways of talking that were perfectly sensible and understandable to them, but it was my job to, you know, learn some Black English in order to understand and work with them. And as we did these after-school programs, I audio taped the group discussions and got more and more interested in the ways the kids talked to each other, less interested in kind of the content or whether they were sort of learning what we were trying to teach them. I was just fascinated by the ways the kids talked to each other. And so then I went back to Northwestern University, decided not to do a PhD in ethnomusicology, but one in education. Mm-hmm. And they didn't have a degree in anthropology and education. Practically nobody did then. But my advisor was the dean of the ed school, and he said, you can take anything you want to, and I'll be your advisor. And so I took a bunch of anthropology and sociology courses and a few courses in education, including an introductory statistics class. He said, you have to take statistics. But at any rate, as it happened, a couple of people had joined the faculty in the anthropology department at that time. One of them, Ethel Albert, had been a colleague of Del Himes and John Gumpert's at Berkeley, and Irving Goffman when Goffman was there. And she came to Northwestern. She was the first tenured woman faculty member at Northwestern. This was 1966. Right? Think of it. Right? And then Edward T. Hall also had just joined the faculty, and he was interested in intercultural communication. So these were people who were doing work on culture and communication. There were some other people I studied with. And I sort of put together an anthropology and education degree substantively, but it was actually called educational administration because the dean was the primary faculty member for educational administration at that time. At any rate, I also got a grant from the Office of Education to do more work on kids' discussion activity, and I did my dissertation. What became my dissertation research was a program where we had middle school kids getting together in small groups, talking about popular records, talking about the lyrics of popular records, and we audio taped again. That seemed to make sense, and transcribed, and this was before discourse analysis really existed, but it was what it became, kind of a discourse study of the persuasion talk, the kind of argumentation that kids had, so anyway, so that I did a dissertation on that, and it was then at the very end of that time that I made the first video tape that I told about yesterday in my talk, and it was such a revelation to be able to see listeners' reactions as people were trying to persuade them of something. And I realized that audiovisual recording really was something that I wanted to work on. Also, Ned Hall had been making little silent Super 8 movies for years, and I worked on some of that footage with him. So I then went to the University of Illinois in Chicago and got a sizable grant from the National Institute for Mental Health, NIMH, to study interethnic job interviews and academic advising interviews. And that led to the counselor's gatekeeper work. And so by then I was, really launched in this kind of microanalysis and recording of face-to-face interaction. And then when I went to Harvard a few years later, in 1974 and 75, we did the first study that I had done in a classroom. We went to a kindergarten, first grade classroom and stayed for 2 years. We followed the kindergartners from the first year all the way through the end of first grade, and interviewing, showing video back to the teacher to get her perspective on what she was doing and on different kids in the room. And I had a wonderful team of doctoral students that I worked with on that. And that was at the same time that Ray McDermott was working on his doctoral thesis with the study of the reading group. And Bud Meehan was also videotaping Courtney Kasdan in San Diego. She took a year off from Harvard, a sabbatical, and went and taught in an inner city classroom, and so that Bud could videotape. And we actually shared a wireless microphone between the two projects, because my project didn't have any money. The Ford Foundation money went to Bud and Courtney, but they had bought a wireless microphone that was professional grade movie industry thing. It was built in Van Nuys, California, I remember. And in 1974, it cost $1,500.
Wow.
That would be like $7,000-8,000 now, probably. They were very expensive, the really good ones. And we flew it back and forth between Boston and San Diego. There was an airline that let people take a package to the pilot. And it sat, think of, since 9/11, nothing like this would happen, but the small packages could be carried in the cockpit. And so my doctoral students would take the mic out to Logan Airport in Boston, put it on the plane, and Bud Meehan's doctoral students would meet at San Diego at the airport and take it, and every few weeks we exchanged this wireless mic through the whole year. So anyway, that was, by then, I was continuing to work on dyadic face-to-face interaction, but also starting to study in classrooms and families face-to-face interaction as a learning environment. And then that's really what I've been doing ever since.
No, that's great. I was really interested to hear sort of how your music background and the sort of focus on what sort of sound and what people are saying came together with your interest in nonverbal communication when you sort of added the visual recording. It's really...
and I ended up also using quasi-musical notation as a way of showing the timing of interaction, and that's still some people have done this since, and there's actually a resurgence of interest right now in kind of microanalysis of timing in oral discourse, but still there's very few people that use musical notation. That's just directly borrowing from ethnomusicology. Just write down in musical notes something about what's going on with these speech sounds. And we've now got software that can very precisely measure time, pitch, and volume in speech streams. And I've been, in my most recent articles, sort of checking my own intuitive musical notation against the machine measurements, and it's very accurate. I wasn't surprised by that, because I knew that good ethnomusicologists could be very accurate, but some people thought for years that those of us who were claiming some things about rhythm and discourse were making it up, and now we know that we're not. Yeah.
If we had time, I'd actually ask you to say a little bit more about sort of how you do that analysis. I remember actually that from grad school, but maybe you'll come back and teach a course and do that. But I think we should move on. In my qualitative methods courses, I often try to get students to think about ethical issues that sort of are beyond what I think we can really have folks think about in terms of IRB.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could give us an example of a time where you had to grapple with an ethical issue and sort of what you did.
Well, there have been times that I've worked with teachers whose teaching I didn't agree with. Lately, I've been blessed by being able to work again with teachers who I really feel very much supportive of, and they realize that I appreciate their teaching, and so, but some of the dilemmas that I've had to do with sort of censoring myself, not being able to be candid with teachers when they were doing something that I disagreed with. And over the years, my relationship with the people that I studied shifted more and more in the direction of participatory action research or collaborative action research. And I have a piece, you probably know, a chapter called Studying Side by Side, where I told about kind of that evolution in my work. And I found that I was able to be much more candid with people, even when there were disagreements, if the kind of contract we had was that we were going to work together on, trying to make instruction better, or
make sense of what's
something
going on.
about getting along with students more easily, and so on. And when that was a joint project, I was then able to stop censoring my opinions. Early on, I bent over backwards, in interviewing teachers and other people I was studying, so as not to put words in their mouth or cue them about, what was the desired opinion that they ought to express. And I so bent over backwards that sometimes they thought these interviewers were, a little weird, and I had something up my sleeve that I wasn't telling. So as I got into this more participatory, kind of collaborative research relationship, those issues, they never completely go away, but they were a whole lot less complicated because we could be more direct with each other. So that's one example. One other, I think I told about it was maybe after the talk yesterday. Once I was contacted by Newsweek when I was at Harvard, and I didn't have tenure, and I'd been doing these studies of interethnic and interracial academic advising interviews, and Newsweek found out about it. They sent a reporter to Boston and wrote up a really good story for their behavioral science feature, which they used to have in every issue. And they also sent a photographer, and he had like 10 rolls of 36 exposure still film that he shot in our research lab office. But I said, you can't use the images from the cinema footage, it was, that we've got, because I told people we wouldn't, we would show some of this at academic meetings, but not in kind of the public media. And so the guy shot 360 pictures and went back to New York, and the editor said, no, you got to have the faces of these people that are being interviewed, and called me, and we had this conversation, and it was a real kind of Faustian bargain offer. It was very tempting, but I said, I'm sorry, and the editor said, well, if we can't have those pictures, we won't run the story. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I guess you can't run the story because I won't violate this understanding.
Right.
And I've not had trouble with the video and the film work. that some people worry about troubles coming from that. I have not had trouble with it, but it's because I've been very, very careful about those kinds of agreements and letting people know who will see the footage under what kinds of circumstances or not. And that has made, I think, made it work for me in a kind of honest and respectful way. But it doesn't come without some costs, and that was one. I mean, I could have really used that publicity at that point.
You were a junior person, right?
I was a junior person.
Yeah.
Right. So, but I succeeded in keeping the devil at the distance of a very long spoon.
Well, I love that example because I think it gets at sort of ethical commitments that you have with individuals that are far beyond IRB, because that was before IRB stuff. It was really about the agreement you made with people with whom you were working. And that's what's really important.
Right, right. Yeah. And we can't do any kind of field work without that kind of trust. You know that from your own work, and everybody who does this realizes that if people think you're up to something, and or they're worried about who you're going to tell about on them. I had a colleague at Circle Campus, my first job, who's a social philosopher, and he's now he became the dean of the ed school at American University. He's done various things, and he's now retired and living in the DC area, and we get together every now and then now. But he wrote a little article in the very early 70s or very, very late 1960s called the Social Scientist as Little Brother. And I was an only child, so the full force of this metaphor didn't get me until I had two children of my own. But the point of it is that sometimes the field worker is in the position of the little brother telling on the older sibling to the more powerful people, and that's a real trap, and you have to really watch out for it. So that's an issue that arises whether you're using audiovisual recording or not, and it's inherent in our kind of work.
I should let you know that your piece, Researching Side by Side, has also influenced some of my more recent work. I've been doing collaborative work with a high school teacher in New York City. And so it's really, really different work from the work that I have done in the past. And it's fabulous. I've learned more about teaching in the few years that I've worked with him than in all the years I've been in the field before. So, it really does change the relationship.
And it changes what you can
learn,
know, right, and feel.
Right. So, I just have a couple more questions. I'm mindful of time. I was wondering if you could give us an example of a sort of generative mistake, in quotes, that you made as a researcher. I mean, things don't always go the way one plans in the field, that something that happened that actually ended up being something you really learned from that was really helpful.
I think maybe the best example of that is something that's in the Studying Side by Side discussion, and I've published it as an anecdote in some other things. When we did this classroom study, the first one in 1974, it was in a blue-collar neighborhood, an Italian-American working class neighborhood in a suburb of Boston. And the teacher was was not Italian American, and she was not working class. Her father was a United Airlines vice president. She grew up in Pasadena, so you can kind of visualize that. And she had a boyfriend who had a sailboat in Marblehead Harbor, and still, they got married. They're still sailing out of Marblehead now. We're still in touch. But anyway, I had used very profitably with the academic advising interviews and some job interviews that I'd studied and videotaped. Video review with the people who were in the interaction. We had separate interviews called viewing sessions with the academic advisor, and then one with the student, where we would play the tape. And I wanted to be very open-ended, as I'd said, and so I would say, it was a 10-minute interview usually, and I would say, we'll play it anytime something new or important happens from your point of view. Say stop and we'll talk about it. We audio taped the comments. We could hear where the sound went off on the video, and we could key the comments then into a transcript of the original interview, and we got a lot of insight from these comments that people made. And sometimes we'd play it 2 or 3 times and get them to stop repeatedly, and it sometimes they didn't want to say anything the first time around, but second, third time, we got a lot of information from this. And we tried this then with this classroom footage, where now it isn't 10 minutes long, we've videotaped the whole school day, right? And whole events, so the opening, what's sometimes called sharing time with the kids sitting on the rug with the teacher, which lasted maybe a half an hour, 40 minutes sometimes. That would be a whole event or a whole lesson. And so we started showing the video to this teacher whose name was Marty Walsh. And I used this same frame. Whenever something important or something new is happening, just holler stop and we'll talk about it and we'll turn it on again. And you direct us to what you want to sort of comment on with this. Well, these were big strips, right? And she said later, the more we did this, the more nervous I got, because I kept thinking, in one sense, everything is new all the time. All kinds of different things are important. There's all sorts of aspects to what I'm trying to do. What are they after? And what is this guy after? He's a professor from Harvard University asking me to talk about, what's important. And he must have some agenda here. And the longer we did this in this open-ended way, the more nervous she got. But she only told us that in the second year that we worked with her, and she was gracious enough to overall realize that we were well-meaning, even though we were kind of bumbling with this viewing session thing. It wasn't until Susan Florio, now Susan Florio-Ruane, worked collaboratively with the teacher in the second year and became really good friends with the teacher, that she owned up to how nervous we had made her at first as we were getting acquainted, because they were watching video together but with a shared project, right? And again, it was this more open kind of discussion between the two of them. And so they finally published a paper called The Teacher as Colleague in Classroom Research. Came out in 1979, and that's, to my knowledge, the first example of somebody writing about collaborating work with a teacher in the modern era, at any rate. And a very thoughtful article that Marty published with Susan under Marty's own name, so everybody knew who she was. And that's another thing, just sidebar, but anonymity isn't necessarily an ethical issue. It's an ethical issue if you want anonymity, but in some kinds of work now, the people we work with don't want anonymity. They want to be able to have their opinions attributed to themselves, and in action research, that's important. At any rate, Susan eventually explained this to me, and ever after, if I was doing viewing sessions with teachers, I used much shorter clips that I chose, even though maybe it would ideally be better to let them just kind of comment on a longer strip, but because of these issues of distrust and discomfort, it worked better to use a shorter clip and say something like, well, why don't we watch what Jimmy is doing, and in the back of the room, and I'd be interested in what you notice in that. And so kind of even focusing substantively. Yeah. And that worked much, much better. So I learned that sometimes the kind of classic Rogerian interviewing absolute neutrality stance doesn't work all that well. It just wasn't plausible to her, because I was a professor of education from Harvard, that I didn't know anything about kindergarten, first grade classrooms. In fact, I didn't. Right. I knew that, right? But she assumed I must have cards up my sleeve that I wasn't sharing. So.
Right. And I think that's a really interesting story, because for so many reasons, but including the fact that, at the time you were not aware that she was actually having these misgivings.
No,
right?
And she wasn't owning up to it.
She wasn't owning up to it, right. She didn't feel comfortable doing that. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. That's great. So I only have one, maybe two more questions. I wondered if you could say a little bit about what you think the future of qualitative research and education should be. What needs to be done next? What kind of work needs to be done next in terms of qualitative work?
Well, I think there's a lot of collaborative work that can be done. And I, some years ago, when research-based practice became a buzzword, when I was the research director at the lab school at UCLA, we did a little seminar. The principal of the school and I co-taught a seminar with doctoral students exploring the idea of practice-based research rather than research-based practice. Yeah. And the idea being that general knowledge about what happens with a whole lot of people or a big experimental field trial doesn't necessarily tell you what to do with particular kids in a local setting at a particular moment in history, right? It's situated practice, really, that is what people do. Teachers don't teach children in general. They teach particular kids. And they have a particular kind of principle and all that. So practice-based research is something that practitioners can do, themselves, and they can do it, I think, sometimes most profitably with a friendly collaborator. I think sometimes they get farther with it, not always. There are some wonderful teacher researchers who are able to kind of follow through all the way. And people like Cindy Ballinger writing about her teaching is just, fabulous. But they're very rare. And more usual can be somebody who works with a coach or a field worker, or So those relationships in schools, in community organizations. I have a former postdoc who's been working with the development of an urban food growing and food distribution network in Susan, Susan Giroux in Denver. Right. Wonderful stuff, but as a qualitative researcher, she's sharing information with them about what they're doing that turns out to be very helpful to them in doing what they want to do, right? So this can very well go beyond schools, but she's studying distributed cognition in this movement, which involves multiple institutions and networks of people, and so that's a line of work that I think can be very profitable, and obviously also multi-site studies. Very often, certainly in that case, it has to be a multi-site kind of study, and many issues lend themselves to that. But the kind of practice-based research possibilities of qualitative research are I think, interesting, and they're in the spirit of the work. I mean, it's not trying to do something that doesn't fit what we're good at. So that's one thought. Another is that I said to the students yesterday when we had our meeting that, and I've been going around saying this, I'm slightly embarrassed to have realized only 6 or 7 years ago kind of a fundamental meaning of the term qualitative research that I had overlooked for all these years. And it has to do with etymology. Qualitas, from the Latin, means kinds of things in the world, qualities of things, we would say in English. And so qualitative research is centrally concerned with identifying kinds of things in the world that are important to people who live in a community of practice, a little society. In the Malinowskian interpretive sense, we want to identify the kinds of things that are important to making meaning that people do in these local circumstances. Gregory Bateson said that an information bit is a difference that makes a difference for a system. This is very much in that sense. And that's a very different front burner interest from what's signaled by the Latin word quantitas, right? Quantitas refers to amounts. And so quantitative research is concerned with how many, how often certain kinds of things occur, and relationships among different kinds of things, some of which might be causal relationships. And that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, but it's a different primary focus, and the identification of the kinds of things that are important to people in their daily lives is prior, really. You can't ask how many of X are there without having first decided what you mean by X, right? And the beauty of everyday life is that it's so habitual that as we're immersed in it, we lose reflective awareness of that. So we're dealing intuitively with all kinds of distinctions of kind as insiders that sometimes are working at cross purposes with each other, right? That's what happens in families where there's dysfunctional families, dysfunctional classrooms, lousy relationships between doctors and patients, or lawyers and clients. Everybody who has routine practices ends up not being reflectively aware of some aspects of those practices. Sometimes those aspects need to be changed, or you need to be able to monitor them. They shouldn't be absolutely transparent and intuitive. And because of that, because everybody's everyday life keeps becoming invisible to all of us, there's always going to be a job for qualitative researchers saying, hey, did you notice that this kind of thing, the recent, I did a kind of retrospective essay a while ago about how I understood working in this neighborhood of North Lawndale and west side of Chicago now more than 50 years ago, that a distinction in kind was very important to the teenagers I was working with, and it was the distinction between country and city, right? And country was not good. That was the last thing you wanted to be as a teenager in Lawndale in the early 1960s. Well, there were all kinds of teachers in schools that I realized by the time I left to go back to graduate school. There were all kinds of teachers and other youth workers who didn't realize how important this country-city distinction was. It was a difference in kind that made a big difference in meaning for people and identity. And had they known that, they could have stopped some fights. I mean, God knows how many fights started in high school from somebody calling somebody else country, right? But it was just absolutely invisible to a whole lot of people. So when we're able to find something like that and share it, and people realize that that's a very useful thing to know and be able to react to, that means we're not going to go out of business.
There you go. I'll have a job still. Well, this is wonderful. Is there anything else you'd like to share, or any other questions you think I should have asked you? That
Well, I don't think so. One other thing that I think temperamentally, those of us who do this kind of work have to be good at handling ambiguity, right? Yeah. And our Myers-Briggs scores are not high on the J dimension, right? We're more P. We're able to keep getting a little more information and thinking about things, and that makes us not very good school administrators or chief executive officers, but we are able to keep kind of conclusions tentative long enough so that we can change our mind, and when we do this work well, as we change our mind, we keep getting closer and closer to the what Malinowski unfortunately called, now we would say, the native's point of view, but that's still, if that is one's aim, you don't get that right off the bat, right? And so you have to have temperamentally a capacity for a kind of patience and giving these insight processes and changing of mind, changing of research questions, giving them time. And not everybody has that kind of temperament. I mean, some people would be driven nuts by that kind of being in the midst of that kind of a process, and they'd want closure faster. So, and if you're that kind of person, you shouldn't be trying to do this work. But if you are that kind of person, you can use that temperament as the research instrument, and get smarter and smarter about what's important to the people that you're working with and observing. So that's
a great bit of
thing.
advice. Yeah. I always say if you're not comfortable with uncertainty, or if you feel you have to have control all the time, this is not the
No. No, and that doesn't mean you're a doormat, and it doesn't, and it doesn't mean that you don't know what you're doing, or that everything just emerges. I hate the word emerge, but it is a process of progressive problem solving, and if you're not comfortable with that, you leap to premature typification conclusions. And that can really be disastrous for the kinds of insight that you're trying to acquire.
Great.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.